The Chicago Blackhawks have fired head coach Luke Richardson.
You're Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Jack Bushman. Please do me a quick favor, hit that like button, jump in the comment section down below as well with your reaction to the Blackhawks firing head coach Luke Richardson. I know it's way too soon, but let me know who you also would like to see take over as the next head coach of the Chicago Blackhawks. Be sure to subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube as well. 100% free, won't cost you anything, and really does help me out tremendously. And last but certainly not least, got to shout out today's sponsor, which is FanDuel. If you're not already a member, go and visit FanDuel.com right now to have a chance to win $150 worth of bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins with America's #1 sportsbook. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you all for joining me on another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, your one-stop shop for all things Chicago Blackhawks. Interesting episode on tap here today, as just about 30 minutes ago, the Chicago Blackhawks officially fired head coach Luke Richardson after spending 2.5 years as the team's head coach. Richardson finishes with a 57, 118, and 15 record in his 2.5 years behind the bench, with the final straw seemingly being the 4-2 loss that the Blackhawks suffered last night to the Boston Bruins. Typical Blackhawks game that we've seen so many times already through the opening 26 contests. A good first period where the Blackhawks show enough to hang around, then things start to go sideways in the second period, and they're not able to do enough to muster their way back in the third. It was something that has happened time and time again this year, and with the Blackhawks also not really showing any life offensively for another season here. And that's really been the story of Luke Richardson, was the story, I should say, of Luke Richardson's tenure, as the Blackhawks were dead last in every significant offensive category since he took over. 5-on-5 goals, scoring chances, high danger opportunities, shot attempts, all that stuff. The Blackhawks were dead last in that. And I think a lot of that just had to do with the style that Luke Richardson wants to play. Defense first at all costs. And I think that style of play didn't really work well with Connor Bedard's development. And we've seen him be as frustrated as he's been at the NHL level. The numbers obviously aren't where we want them to be. And I think just a greater fact that the general direction of this team for the rest of the year under Luke Richardson's leadership, it was going to be shaky. And one thing I do want to preface, I was surprised that the Blackhawks fired Luke Richardson this early into the season, but I certainly do understand it. The reason why I was surprised, though, is because of the aspirations around this Blackhawks team. It's not like this team was a Stanley Cup contender or anything. It's not really like this year is going to matter all that much. But as I talked about a couple of weeks ago, this big problem that the Blackhawks were, they were stuck in between a rock and a hard place, because not only were they not taking steps in the right direction as a team, even though we knew they weren't playoff contenders, but we also weren't seeing the development out of the young players that we wanted to see. And I think that was because of Luke Richardson's system and the way he goes about things. Connor Bedard, being a center iceman, has to focus in on a lot of defensive responsibilities, because that's what Luke Richardson puts on his center iceman. Lukas Reichel, who's had to play the center ice spot on the Blackhawks' fourth line all year long, despite being clearly the most talented skater on this team, at least skater who actually has offensive abilities to pair with it, yet he's playing 11 minutes per game. And I think the bigger problem, too, if you were to keep Luke Richardson around, it would be really tough, considering his style, the offensive struggles. I mean, the offense has been legitimately pitiful this season. It would be hard to call up a prospect like a Frank Nazar, like a Colton Dach, and expect them to go and do well with Luke Richardson's system, because we had seen how that went for Lukas Reichel over the last year and a half, and don't even get me started about how Richardson handled Reichel last year. I thought it was an absolute disaster. And even though Reichel has been looking a lot better as a player and producing pretty well on the fourth line, that hasn't earned him more of a sizable role, more minutes or anything. And it's like, okay, well, if we're not going to give the young guys opportunities, we at least got to be winning. We at least got to be taking steps in the right direction. And neither of this was happening. So it was kind of like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do for these final, 60 games of the regular season here, 55 games, whatever it may be. Not a math major. That's why I went to school for journalism. So yeah, while I didn't think the Blackhawks were going to fire Luke Richardson, I thought they were going to let him finish the season and then next year was going to be a team option. I did not think the Blackhawks were going to pick up that team option because of what has gone down under Luke Richardson's tenure, but I understand why Kyle Davidson felt like he had to go in a different direction, because watching this style of play, watching what was going on with this Blackhawks team and continuing to allow them to go on the same path for the remainder of the season, I think that wasn't going to be good for anybody. So I get why Kyle Davidson did what he did. Shocking move that Luke Richardson, though, gets fired 26 games into the season. I do want to be sure to preface, though, that I think Luke Richardson being a first-year head coach also put him in a real tricky spot. Obviously, the roster hasn't been super talented these last few years. And listen, in comparison to Jeremy Colleton, Luke Richardson as a first-year head coach is head and shoulders above Jeremy Colleton. At least Luke Richardson knows how to keep games competitive. He knows how to do good things defensively. The Blackhawks in the special teams departments are in the top half of the NHL on both the power play and the penalty kill. And I think the culture, the message, all in all, even though maybe that message had kind of gotten stale to some of the guys in the locker room, altogether, I thought Luke Richardson established a pretty good culture for a first-year head coach. So he does deserve credit for that. I just think he was put in a real tough spot. And as a first-year head coach, he just didn't necessarily have the solutions to fix the Blackhawks' problems on the fly. And unfortunately, he's now out of a job because of that. I think Luke Richardson is going to learn from this experience. I think probably his next job isn't going to be a head coaching spot, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him in charge of defensemen for another NHL club and just continue to rack up good experiences, because I do think he can be a serviceable guy on a team's bench. It's just for a full-scale rebuild right here, right now, the spot the Blackhawks are in, I didn't think he was the guy for that. I think he could be a good guy to add on to a Stanley Cup playoff contender who's trying to tighten things up a little bit on the back end, because Luke Richardson has shown us he knows what he's doing on the defensive side of things. He's a 1,500 game former NHLer defensive defenseman, so he knows all about it. He's a former player himself, and I think that was part of him creating a good culture and, for the most part, players enjoying their time under Luke Richardson. I know losing isn't easy for anyone, but as far as how he went about coaching, I think the players like playing for him for the most part. So I think Luke Richardson is going to be better off in the long term from all of these experiences. I'm sure it's a tough day for him. I'm sure he feels like he failed the Blackhawks organization. And yeah, it's not going to be easy, but this is just something the Blackhawks, I think, had to do when they were looking in the mirror, because continuing, as I've mentioned, along this path that they've been on these opening 26 games, right, and just being such an offensive struggle for them to score more than 2 goals against legitimately anybody, they just couldn't go on like that and couldn't risk Connor Bedard's development in his sophomore campaign, even though he's only 19 years old, right? Like, the way Luke Richardson kind of gave him a bunch of different line mates this year and put him in different spots and never established a consistent line for Connor, I think that was a huge blunder of his as well. So unfortunate that Luke Richardson winds up getting fired, but that's the nature of the beast. Anders Sorensen now going to take over as the Blackhawks interim head coach. Mark Eaton is going to take over for Sorensen down in Rockford. The plan is for Sorensen to remain the head coach for the remainder of the season. Quite honestly, Blackhawks fans, I'm pretty intrigued by this idea. I know Sorensen doesn't have a ton of coaching experience aside from what he's done in Rockford. Obviously has never been up to the NHL level as a head coach, but he is someone who's been very familiar with the development level of this organization for the last few years. He's been close with someone like Alex Vlasic, Nolan Allen, Wyatt Kaiser, spent time with all of those guys down in Rockford, and is very familiar with a Frank Nazar, Cole Gutman, Colton Dock, Landon Slaggert, Kevin Korchinski. So I think this is a good spot for Anders Sorensen to be in terms of, I think he's going to be ushered in to help the development of this Blackhawks team. And I think they're going to get away from that defensive-minded style a little bit that Luke Richardson has really instilled on this group. And I do think that's going to be better in the long run for Connor Bedard and also for Frank Nazar, who I figure is now more likely to get a call-up because he's not going to have to play in Luke Richardson's system as a defensive-minded center. There were some concerns about, if you call him up and he doesn't have success, could we be dealing with another Lucas Reichel situation on our hands? And that's absolutely something we wanted to avoid. So Anders Sorensen taking over, quite honestly, has me excited to see just a new-look Blackhawks because even though we were only 26 games in, it had gotten real old watching this team. And I think there can be some more excitement around this group now. And I think they can be a little bit more free with some of these players. So I'm interested to see how things are going to look with Anders Sorensen. Ultimately, the Blackhawks just needed a shakeup. Their style of play had gotten so stale. It was hard to win games. Basically impossible to win games the way they were playing with their lack of speed, the lack of offense. I mean, Peter Mrazek and the goaltender, Arvid Soderblom, or Laurent Brossoit whenever he's going to be healthy. Luke Richardson's system basically required the Blackhawks goalie, whoever it may be, to stand on their heads and allow 2 goals or fewer. That was the only way this Blackhawks team was going to win games. Couldn't take much more of it. So, yeah, surprised that Luke Richardson got fired. But again, I do understand why Kyle Davidson ultimately went with this route. There are my thoughts on Luke Richardson getting fired here by the Chicago Blackhawks earlier this afternoon. Coming up in just a moment here, Blackhawks fans, I'll touch on Connor Bedard being left off Canada's 4 Nations roster. But first, real quick, I do got to talk to you all about the fine folks over at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the second half of the NFL action, in the regular season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and win $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. And the FanDuel Sportsbook app now gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place, so that when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you also happen to place your bets. And not only do the Chicago Blackhawks now have a new coach, but so do the Chicago Bears. And if you think they're going to be riding that new interim coach boost throughout the rest of the regular season, make sure to go and check out FanDuel.com. And if you're not already a member, sign up. You'll have a chance to win $150 worth of bonus bets if your first $5 bet cashes. Again, that's FanDuel.com with the code LOCKEDONNHL in all caps to have a chance to win $150 worth of bonus bets. FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the National Football League. Back here on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Real quick, just wanted to say thank you to everyone for making Locked On Blackhawks your very first listen. Now, for your second listen, make sure to go and check out the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast so that you can become a fantasy hockey expert and get daily tips from Steal and Flip. And you can easily find the link to Locked On Fantasy Hockey down in the description of this video, or you can search on YouTube and wherever you may be listening to your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Segment 2, big day today for the Chicago Blackhawks. Big day yesterday for hockey as a whole as the 4 Nations rosters were released for the United States, Canada, Sweden, and Finland. The tournament, by the way, for those who might not know, is set to take place from February 12th to February 20th and will be split between Boston's TD Garden and Montreal's Bell Center. Should be an unbelievable atmosphere. Going to be a round-robin format in which each team plays 3 games with the top 2 teams, then moving on to the winner-take-all final. And of course, the NHL has not taken part in a best-on-best hockey tournament since nearly a decade ago, way back in 2016 at the World Cup, where Canada wound up emerging victorious, but there has been a lot of interest about who was going to wind up on these final rosters. Of course, Connor Bedard had been in the mix potentially for Team Canada, but ultimately Bedard wound up being left off of Team Canada's roster. And listen, it wasn't just Bedard. There were a lot of notable omissions for Team Canada, but it was pretty clear that they built their team from around their net, in my opinion, and went with a deep squad that can, in particular, handle the Americans and some of the pests in the speed that they have up front. So getting into Canada's roster, leading the charge offensively, Connor McDavid, Nathan McKinnon, Sidney Crosby, Mitch Marner, Brad Marchand, Sam Reinhart, Sam Bennett, Mark Stone. Shout out to Brandon Hagel for making this team, baby. So happy that Brandon Hagel's a member of Team Canada. An awesome glue guy for that squad. He's going with teammate Braden Point, Travis Konechny from the Flyers, kind of a surprising addition to the roster, along with Anthony Cirelli and Seth Jarvis appear to be the last forward on the roster, which was super cool because I think going back to 2020 or 2021, Seth Jarvis was among the final cuts for Team Canada's U20 World Juniors team. So just a couple years later to see him being among the final players to make Team Canada's roster for the Four Nations tournament has to feel good for Seth Jarvis, someone who I loved in that draft class, and it's been awesome to see him succeed so well at the NHL level. Real good dude, too. On the back end for Canada is where things get interesting. Cale Makar, Alex Pietrangelo, and Devon Taves are the one who lead the charge. Josh Morrissey is back there as well, along with Shea Theodore. Colton Parayko and Travis Sanheim is probably the biggest surprise on this roster as a whole. I think, according to JFresh Hockey, only 4% of fan voters thought that Travis Sanheim was going to be on this team. And then for Canada, I think it's all going to come down in this tournament to how well they fare in net. Certainly the weakest part of their team, Jordan Binnington, Aiden Hill, Sam Montembeault. Not exactly a group that, if I was Canadian, I would feel the most confident in, but certainly enough star power at the forward and D spots to go and get the job done to have Canada pick up where they left off the last time the NHL had a best-on-best tournament. As far as the omissions for Team Canada, a lot of notables. As I mentioned, our baby boy Connor Bedard. Matt Barzal left off the team. Alexis Lafreniere, Matt Duchene, Mark Scheifele, Zach Hyman, Steven Stamkos, Macklin Celebrini, Robert Thomas. On the back end, to me, the biggest surprise was Mackenzie Weegar. I thought Mackenzie Weegar should have made that team over Travis Sanheim personally. Evan Bouchard being left off the team, I thought was a little interesting as well, but clearly they wanted to go with defensive prowess over offensive game, and from what I've been reading, that's something that Canada typically has gone with in their best-on-best rosters, but Bouchard and Weegar, I probably would have taken both of those guys over Colton Parayko and Travis Sanheim personally. Aaron Ekblad left off, same with Brandon Montour, and then Logan Thompson and Marc-Andre Fleury, kind of splitting hairs there. I probably would have had Logan Thompson over Sam Montembeault, but it's just me personally. Would have been cool to have Marc-Andre Fleury there for nostalgia reasons. Then going down to the red, white, and blue. Oh, baby, is this a team? Austin Matthews, Jack Hughes, Jack Eichel, JT Miller. You got the Tkachuk brothers running wild. Vinny Trocheck, surprisingly, on the team. Dylan Larkin, Kyle Connor, Matt Boldy. Shout out to the kids. Shout out Seth Topol and the Minnesota Wild for just having an unbelievable start to the season. Matt Boldy has been an absolute stud from that 2019 draft class. Jake Gensel, Brock Nelson, the real surprising one of this squad, along with Chris Kreider. And then on the back end for the red, white, and blue, it's Quinn Hughes, Zach Werenski, Charlie McAvoy, Adam Fox, Brock Faber, Jacob Slavin, and Noah Hannafin. Yeah, they got the leading goal scorer in the NHL. They got the reigning Norris Trophy winner. And then, of course, finishing things off in net, in my opinion, the most underrated, not goaltender, underrated player in the NHL, Mr. Connor Hellebuck. Jake Ottinger is going to be there as well. Jeremy Swayman, too. Much stronger United States group in goal compared to Team Canada. I think there's a real good shot the United States winds up taking this thing home. Omissions for the U.S. roster, the forwards I think were the real notable ones, and ultimately the United States elected to go with guys like Trocheck, Nelson, and Kreider, who bring a little bit more sandpaper and can play in front of the net and in the dirty areas, and they passed on Cole Caulfield, Brock Besser. Tage Thompson should have been on this team. I don't know how Tage Thompson doesn't make this team over Chris Kreider or Brock Nelson. You can't have both of those guys over Tage Thompson, in my opinion. I think Cole Caulfield's shot would have been good to have on that right-hand side, but they do still have Jack Eichel to potentially play there on the man advantage. Just feels like the lefty goal scorers are going to be doing the charge for the USA offense. Austin Matthews, Kyle Connor, Matt Boldy, Jake Gensel, they're all left-handed guys, so would have given at least one big right-handed shot either with Tage Thompson or Cole Caulfield there. Jason Robertson for the Dallas Stars, just off to a slow start to this year, winds up getting left off Team USA's roster. So does Clayton Keller. Outside of Tage Thompson, I can get why they left guys with no size like Caulfield, Robertson, and Keller off the team. Tage Thompson, man, that just makes no sense to me. But I still absolutely love this USA squad. John Carlson, Jake Sanderson, those were kind of the two omissions defensively that I saw people were mentioning. Had Thatcher Demko been healthy, I think there would have been a conversation for him to be there potentially over Jeremy Swayman, considering how inconsistent he's been so far this year. But I really do love this United States roster. Moving down to Sweden here, love their forward group, man. William Nylander, Lucas Raymond, Philip Forsberg, Victor Arvidsson, William Karlsson, Elias Pettersson, Leo Carlsson, Gustav Nyquist, Jesper Bratt, Mika Zibanejad, Adrian Kempe, like, whoo, baby. And then they got Joel Eriksson Ek too. And then on the back end, Rasmus Dahlin, Erik Karlsson, Matthias Ekholm, Rasmus Andersson, Jonas Brodin, Victor Hedman, Gustav Forsling. Like, that's a pretty darn good team. And then in net, Philip Gustafsson, Jacob Markstrom, and Linus Ullmark. Pretty solid there for Team Sweden. The two notable omissions that kind of stood out to me: William Eklund, who has been off to a phenomenal start to the year with the San Jose Sharks, gets left off. Saw some people suggesting maybe they take a youngster like Simone Edvinsson of the Detroit Red Wings. Rickard Rakell, also, I saw him post on social media that he was a little disappointed as to being left off this roster, but Sweden could be a good underdog here. And then last but certainly not least, moving over to Finland, Alexander Barkov leads the way offensively with Sebastian Aho, Miku Rantanen, Rupe Hintz, Capo Kakko. The lone Blackhawk that will be playing in this tournament represents Finland. That is Mr. Teuvo Teravainen, Patrick Laine, Mikael Granlund, Arturi Lehkonen, and Eetu Luosterainen, as well as Joel Armia and Eric Haula. Baby Barkey, Anton Lundell rounds things out with their forward group. Miro Heiskanen, Oli Mata, Blackhawks legend. It doesn't matter who you are. What matters is our plan. Is on the back end for Finland. I just had to get that in there. Asa Lindell there as well. Jani Hakanpää, Rasmus Ristolainen, Riku Mikola, Juuso Välimäki. Shout out to Juuso Välimäki. Shout out to anyone who just unfortunately watched me spit all over myself. For anyone out there who might be a golf fan like I am, Juuso Välimäki's cousin, Sammy Välimäki, finished runner-up at the Mexico Open this past year. Thought it was pretty cool to hear that they were cousins. And then in net, rounding things out for Finland, UC Saros figure they're going to be relying on him heavily. UPL figures to be the backup. And hey, shout out to Blackhawks legend Kevin Lankinen for being the third goaltender on Finland's roster. I know I'm biased here as a American, but I really do think the United States has the best roster altogether. Canada certainly has talent, but there are some questions. And as far as a best-on-best Canada roster, it's still a good roster, but I think this is the most underwhelming one I've seen, at least personally. And I'll tell you what, Sweden has a heck of a squad there. So I personally am really excited for this Four Nations face-off in February. Jump in the comment section down below. Let me know if you're as pumped for this tournament as I am. And also go and let me know who's your pick to win this bad boy in February of 2025. But there is everything on the Four Nations rosters that were released yesterday. Coming up in just a moment here, Blackhawks fans, before I wrap things up, I got some things to say about CHSN. Segment 3. Oh, forgot that was a thing. Segment 3, before I close things out on today's show, I did want to talk for a moment about more frustrations boiling over yesterday surrounding the whole CHSN situation. And of course, we're now 26 games into the year. There still isn't a deal between CHSN and Xfinity, meaning the only ways to still watch Blackhawks games at this point in time, you either go the 1970s route and go and buy an antenna and hope you have clear connection and hope it's good weather and hope you're able to put it up somewhere high. think it's absolutely ridiculous that fans are being asked to buy an antenna in the year 2024. You can also have Fubo TV. You can also have DirecTV, which is not the primary cable provider here in the Chicagoland area, so I'm not sure how many people are actually watching through there. You can illegally stream it, which I think is probably the most common way, or you can be a subscriber to CHSN, which dropped probably 2 to 3 weeks ago now and is $19.99 per month to watch the Blackhawks, the Bulls, and the Chicago White Sox, the Chicago Blackhawks, and the Chicago Bulls. 3 absolutely abysmal teams, and we're being asked to pay $19.99 a month. And if you don't subscribe to CHSN, the problem is, how are you going to watch this Blackhawks team? And with this Blackhawks team being where they're at the bottom of the standings once again, not a whole lot of competitive fire. Hopefully that'll, well, they've been competitive, not a lot of winning. And with that being the case, I feel like it's put fans in a real tricky position. And I've started to have this realization a little bit more. It's tough for me because as someone who, it's my job to watch the Blackhawks day in and day out, I don't have that. I'm trying to think of how to put this. Like I'm not the typical Blackhawks fan. I'm already diehard. I'm already signed in for the long term. I'm already signed up for the long haul here because of my job, and I'm going to watch every Blackhawks game regardless. But talking with some of my buddies over the weekend, people who I grew up watching the Blackhawks with, some of the best memories I have in my entire life, watching the Blackhawks go on those summer Stanley Cup runs, watching with my buddies. Those are memories I'll never forget. People who made me fall in love with the Chicago Blackhawks and the game of hockey because it was just such a fun time to be watching this team. And all my friends who I was having this conversation with as we were having a Friendsgiving this past weekend, all have been as big of Blackhawks fans as I have been throughout the years. But over these last few years, as they've been bottom dwellers, there hasn't been a lot of interest out of my buddies. And I certainly can't blame them, especially when they're being asked to pay $19.99 a month or illegally stream the Blackhawks in order to watch. They're not able to watch on their televisions in their living room. It is absolutely a huge problem, man. And I was kind of inspired to go on this talk here on today's episode based on a post that Mark Lazarus, an article from Mark Lazarus of The Athletic last night. And I felt the same way as he did as he was writing that article. I felt the same way about his feelings, in which now that the Blackhawks have fired Luke Richardson, I think this is a good time to go and make CHSN free for everybody, at the very least, until you get a deal done between CHSN and Xfinity, because it's absolutely unacceptable for the app to be the only way to watch this Blackhawks team. It's so frustrating when it feels like Danny Wirtz has stepped in as the new CEO, and I know he's done a lot of good things for this team, and I know he said a lot of the right things, but ultimately, there are a lot of people, if this doesn't get resolved, there are a lot of people who are going to start putting him in the conversation as his grandpa, Bill Wirtz, in that same conversation, because those fans are getting the same type of feelings from those eras. The Blackhawks aren't on TV. They're not very good. There's not a whole lot of excitement or buzz around the squad. It's a huge problem. And if the Blackhawks don't do this, if they don't find a solution in order to get some engagement around this team and to grow new fans, like, we risk going into a dark spot once again. And people are going to blame you, Danny Wirtz. People are going to blame you. And Danny, I know you subscribe to the podcast. You follow me on X. If you're watching this, man, you got to do something. You can't just sit back and it would be like continuing to let Luke Richardson coach this team. You can't just sit back and let what's happening right now continue to happen through the rest of the regular season. And I know Danny Wirtz and some folks from the Blackhawks and the people who are representing CHSN that are at the table with Xfinity are saying, well, there's no deal for us to sign. There's no offer here. Baloney. Even if that is true, you guys had forever to go about planning this, and your preparation was absolutely horrible. And now you're making the fans pay the price for your mistakes. It's an absolute joke. Absolute joke. For where this team is right here, right now, you cannot be asking fans to pay $19.99 a month to be the only way to watch this team. You're going to put us back in the dark ages. Danny Wirtz, you got to fix this. Last night was atrocious. For those of you, I don't blame anyone who didn't tune into the Blackhawks-Bruins game last night, but it was televised on TNT. And there were reports from Ben Pope from the Chicago Sun-Times early on Wednesday morning that TNT was going to be blacked out in the Chicagoland area. The only way you were going to be able to watch the game was illegally streaming it, antenna, or through the CHSN app. Then, shortly before puck drop, Ben Pope announces that, I don't know if it was a Blackhawks team source or a TNT source, but someone reached out to Ben and told him that the game was going to be televised on TNT. There were not going to be regional blackouts in the Chicagoland area. Then, just before the game starts, there's blackouts. Not for everybody. Folks like me who have YouTube TV, there was a blackout right off the rip. And it's like, oh, nice. Good plan in here. Fortunately, I have HBO Max, so I was able to switch over there. But I do know people who were watching on TNT last night in the middle of the game got blacked out. Just in the middle of the game. This is such a joke. Such a joke. And now that you've gotten rid of Luke Richardson, it feels like this is a time to kind of start fresh. Have a new opportunity to go about things in a different way, both on the ice and off the ice. It has to change. Just like what was going on with the Blackhawks team on the ice with Luke Richardson calling the shots, we couldn't watch more games of that. We couldn't do it. Kyle Davidson had to make a tough decision. Danny Wirtz, you're going to have to make a tough decision here, bud, because guess what? Not getting enough money for your ads and whatever you're holding off to get a deal with Xfinity for, it's not as bad as losing this fan base entirely, losing the casual fans. There's always going to be those diehards like myself and those who regularly tune into the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, despite this team being an absolute circus. Us diehards are always going to be there. But if the Blackhawks continue to go about things the way that they are as a business, they're going to lose the casuals completely, and that's going to put us back in the dark ages. So a change on the ice for the Blackhawks here today, even though Luke Richardson technically wasn't on the ice. I think it would be a good time to make some changes off the ice as well. This CHSN launch has been an absolute disaster. And when I know some of my best friends who are diehard Blackhawks fans have just completely kind of quit on this team, tells me we're in a real bad spot. And something's got to change right here, right now. So there are my thoughts on another disastrous night with CHSN and the Blackhawks broadcasting rights. It's going to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Blackhawks. I know there was a lot to break down on the show. Thank you to everyone who stuck with me up until the end. Just a reminder to please go hit that like button again and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube. That way you can get the latest episode as soon as it's uploaded each and every day. If you want to check me out on X, you can find my personal at Jack Bushman too. But go and follow my strictly Blackhawks account at Talkin' Hockey. That way you can get all of the latest Blackhawks news and updates. So until the next episode, everyone, have a great rest of your day. It's supposed to be 50 on Sunday over the weekend. It's going to feel like 70. It might be short sleeve t-shirt weather. Hope everyone enjoys. I'll see you next time on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.